Willie D Live.
What's up, family? This is a cold-blooded story, ice cold. And it's further proof that many black folks are in the position of not having generational wealth, not because we don't want it or because we haven't worked for it, but because of jealousy and greed from white folks who stole it and were protected by local and state officials and law enforcement and your government. Yeah, fam, this is cold-blooded. On March 26, 1944, 6 white men brutally lynched Reverend Isaac Simmons, a black minister and farmer, so they could steal his land in Amite County, Mississippi. Members of his family, some of whom witnessed his murder, fled the state, fearing for their lives. The white men responsible for lynching him successfully stole Simmons' land and were never convicted for their crimes. Before his death, Reverend Simmons controlled more than 270 acres of debt-free Amite County land that his family had owned since 1887. This was very unusual among black families in the South, where racism and poverty had posed obstacles to economic advancement for generations. The Reverend Simmons worked the land with his children and grandchildren, producing crops and selling the property's lumber. In 1941, a rumor spread that there was oil in southwest Mississippi. A group of 6 white men decided they wanted the Simmons land and warned the Reverend Simmons to stop cutting lumber. The Reverend Simmons consulted a lawyer to work out the dispute and ensure his children would be the sole heirs to the property. On Sunday, March 26, 1944, a group of white men arrived at the home of the Reverend Simmons' eldest son, Eldridge, and told him to show them the property line. He agreed to do so. But while Eldridge Simmons rode with the men in their vehicle, they began to beat him and shouted that Simmons' family thought they were smart niggers for consulting a lawyer. The uncivilized mutts then dragged the Reverend Simmons from his home about a mile away and began beating him too. They drove both Simmons men further on the property and ordered the Reverend Simmons out the car, then killed him brutally, shooting him 3 times and cutting out his tongue. The uncivilized mutts let Eldridge Simmons go, but told him he and his relatives had 10 days to abandon the family property. The white men who committed the lynching took possession of the land. The constable and sheriff concluded immediately that the Reverend Simmons had met his death at the hands of parties unknown, even though his son Eldridge and his daughter Laura were present and able to identify by name at least 4 of the 6 men responsible. The family fled Amite County over the next 2 days, fearing for their lives before their father's funeral on March 29th. Eldridge remained in Amite for their father's funeral, but was taken into police custody the next day, supposedly for his own protection. Held in jail for more than a week despite being the victim, Eldridge was released from jail on April 8th and was urged to leave the county altogether. Only one of the 6 white men responsible was ever prosecuted for the Reverend Simmons' lynching. On November 1st, 1944, more than 7 months after their father was lynched, Eldridge and his sister Laura were arrested in New Orleans, Louisiana, on charges that they had fled the state in order to avoid testifying as witnesses in the trial of the only white man prosecuted for murdering their father. During the trial on November 11, 1944, Eldridge and Laura refused to name the perpetrators in their testimony because they feared for their lives in the event of a conviction. The one white man was ultimately acquitted by an all-white jury because of lack of evidence. During the era of racial terror, white mobs regularly terrorized black people with violence and murder to maintain their racial hierarchy and exert economic control. These acts of lawlessness were committed with impunity by mobs who rarely faced arrest, prosecution, or even public shame for their actions. Black people could expect little protection from law enforcement and knew that protesting their own abuse or a loved one's lynching could result in even more violence and death. The Reverend Simmons was one of at least 14 Black people lynched in Amite County from 1865 to 1950. There were millions around the country lynched. And here's something else, fam. These lynchings did not just happen in the South, like some of y'all were taught to believe. Yeah, these lynchings were happening all over the country, more frequently in the South. But these lynchings were happening all over the country, just like these police shootings are happening all over the country. Now, why is it so important to tell this story? These stories have to be told so that we can know the true history. So, see, when you tell the truth, you expose the lie. And that's what they don't want to happen. See, now, when you know the truth, oh, so the blacks aren't lazy. Oh, so they're not so they did, even over 100 years ago. They actually had it. They were actually striving. They actually had land. They actually had their own schools and hospitals and fire stations and police departments, and they had their own hospitals. They were self-sufficient and independent. So what happened? These uncivilized mutts came and destroyed it, killed everybody, and ran off the ones who were lucky enough to get away. And your government was cool with it. Your local law enforcement let it go down. Your state officials accepted it. They were cool with it. In fact, I would dare say that they were involved too. Just like they were card-carrying members of the KKK. Yeah. One of the reasons why slavery was enacted in the first place is because you had politicians who owned slaves. They was getting their cut off the slave trade. Even those politicians who were up top had a piece of the slave trade. That's why they didn't want to get rid of it. A lot of those politicians, boy, they was from the South. They wanted to live in the South so they could own human beings. So if, again, the government is making the laws, they're enforcing laws, they can decide whether they want to enforce the law or not. They make the laws, they can determine whether they're going to enforce it or not. So every diabolical act they've ever done, they've used the law to justify it. If somebody go out and commit a crime right now, think about it, fam. How often do you think banks would get robbed? How more often do you think banks would be robbed if the police didn't immediately start searching for suspects and immediately get somebody and lock them up? But if everybody could just walk into a bank and say, hey, give me that money, and walk out, what's going to stop somebody from doing it? See, a lot of people, the only thing that stops a lot of people from committing crimes is fear of legal retribution. That's the only thing that really stops a lot of people. Because you know, like I know, it's some people, if you had a chance, you would walk up to them and slap the hell out of them right now if you thought there wouldn't be any legal repercussions. Like, man, I can't stand that. Click, click. You know what I'm saying? The law, fam. They've always used the law. They've always hidden behind the law. And if they want to commit a crime, if something is a crime, and if they want to be able to do it and get away with it, they'll just go legalize it. Or they'll make sure if they commit the crime, they got enough juice to get a pass for them committing the crime. Now, you can't do the same thing because, these laws are to protect them, not you. Thousands and thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of black people had their land stolen. Millions and millions and millions of acres stolen from black people around this country. And oftentimes that land was not just stolen by regular white folks, it was stolen by local and state officials. That's how they built their wealth, stealing. So yeah, I'm going to continue to put stories out like this every chance I get. I'll end like I started. Many black people are in the position of not having generational wealth, not because we didn't want it or didn't work for it, but because it was stolen by white folks who was jealous, who was greedy, who was protected by members of law enforcement and your local and state officials, and given further protection by your government. No more talk.